All right, hello and welcome back to Scotist Boy Summer. Today we're going to be taking a look at Scotist's teachings on metaphysics, because I really think that metaphysics is the foundation of everything else. In theology, this is especially true for Scotus. And I actually think quite a bit of the differences in terms of conclusions that Thomas and Scotus come to have to do with disagreements about metaphysics. Now, in this stream, I'm trying at the same time to make this stream accessible to two groups of people: those who have not studied metaphysics at all, and Thomas, who might be interested in where Scotus differs on metaphysics. So I'll try to make things introductory while also highlighting spots that are differences so that both audiences can understand. All right, so we can begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Blessed John Duns Scotus, you strove to understand, explain, and defend the truths of the holy Christian faith in light of human reason. For all truths, natural and supernatural, are from one and the same source, the eternal God, who is truth and light and love. Enlighten us to understand your most profound teachings on the first science, the science of the transcendentals. Most holy Theotokos, mother of the one teacher of all, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so what is metaphysics? A lot of people today throw around the word metaphysics to essentially mean things that are almost beyond reason, and that's not at all the case for the historic meaning. So metaphysics, in terms of its etymology, it's a word that comes up first, not actually in the text of Aristotle, but in the title of a book that he titles The Metaphysics. And so sort of the historical etymology of this is most likely that there was a whole corpus of works by Aristotle. There was a book that studied the natural world. So in Greek would be physikos. So you had the book called the Physics. And then there's a book that comes afterwards. And so that book got called the Metaphysics then. And so metaphysics then as a subject sort of became everything that's talked about in this book called the Metaphysics. But the scholastics understood it to actually be the name of a subject of a science, not merely what's contained in the book by Aristotle. And so they took it to mean that which surpasses physics. So meta meaning here beyond, and then physics being the study of the natural world or mobile being. And so metaphysics goes beyond that. It ultimately studies, well, we're going to go in a second and talk about what it studies. And metaphysics is understood to be the foundation of all other sciences, both natural and divine. So this is sort of the great paradox of the study of metaphysics, is it's one of the hardest subjects in philosophy. But everything we do in philosophy, in terms of both the study of the natural world and the study of theology, is going to take its principles from metaphysics. So what exactly is the subject of metaphysics? This became a difficult subject because Aristotle seems to discuss a number of different unrelated things in the metaphysics. And so the Muslim philosopher Averroes understood the subject of the metaphysics to be the study of God. And now, an important issue with this is that for Aristotle, a science cannot prove its own subject. So we have to already presume the subject of it, and then the point of the science is to study what is contained within that subject. And so for Averroes, we prove the existence of God in physics, and then in metaphysics, now we can study God. Avicenna strongly opposed this view of Averroes, saying, no, the subject isn't God. The subject is being qua being. It's being considered in itself. So in writing, right, or grammar rather, we might consider being in words. In mathematics, we might consider being in numbers. In physics, we consider being as mobile. But now we need a science which just studies being in itself. And I actually think this is probably closer to what Aristotle means by metaphysics. But Aristotle also studies many things in the book titled The Metaphysics that don't really fall under this, which created quite a bit of confusion. Now, the majority of the medievals sided with Avicenna, although there was a very significant Averroist strain as well. And Scotist seems pretty clearly to fall into the camp of Avicenna here, as well as St. Thomas does. And Scotist, more specifically, is going to call metaphysics the science of the transcendentals. Now, where is the place of metaphysics in the order of the sciences? For Aristotle, and this is the case with most of the medievals as well, metaphysics ends up becoming last because it is known by abstraction. We first know that which is perceived by our senses, and then we move up from there and abstract outwards until eventually we are just at being, and now we are at the study of being in itself. But for Scotist, metaphysics is actually the first of the sciences, and it's known through the intuition of the concept of being. Now, this was not always put into practice, actually, in the study of metaphysics among Scotists. Nicholas Benatus, an early Scotist, and not a strict Scotist, he was a very creative Scotist. He actually was the first one to argue that metaphysics should actually be studied first. And this was also a position taken up by the Scotist Sebastian du Pasquier, who wrote a whole course on philosophy. And the first volume is on logic, but then after logic, he thinks you can move right on to metaphysics. On the other hand, many Scotists disagreed that this should actually be the order it is studied in. So Bartholomew Mastrius still places it last in the actual order of study. And so when we're saying it's first in the order of sciences, we're not necessarily saying it should be studied first, but in terms of its logic, it has a logical priority in the order of the sciences. Right. So how do we actually be a good metaphysician? And this is, I think, an important point. Joseph Owens, the good Thomist metaphysician, brings out the point that metaphysics is not just a series of conclusions we learn, but it's a certain habit of the mind that we come to be able to analyze the causes of things and be able to actually understand being. And so metaphysics is built on reason, but it can never be detached from its end in God, and thus Christ and the Trinity. And I think that this is a very important point, that if we're just considering natural examples that we can know by abstraction, we are going to be able to come up with a pretty good metaphysics. But there's certain areas we're not going to be able to come to the right answer on, or we're going to have trouble doing it. And once we then have revelation, it's going to give us lots of examples that we now have to factor into our metaphysics, right? So the Trinity lets us know that we need to be able to understand a way in which God can be three in person and one in substance. The incarnation lets us know that we're going to need to have a way that we can understand how one person can be of two natures. Our Mariology is going to let us know that there needs to be a way in which a finite person can bear an infinite person. And so there are many interesting metaphysical problems raised by Christian revelation, which is going to allow us to more precisely hone in our teachings on metaphysics. I want to read a great quote by St. Bonaventure on really what is the core of metaphysics. This is in the Collations on the Hexameron. St. Bonaventure says that Christ is the metaphysical center that leads us back, and this is the sum total of our metaphysics, concerned with emanation, exemplarity, and consummation. That is, illumination through spiritual radiations, and return to the supreme being, and in this you will be a true metaphysician. A point St. Bonaventure stresses over and over again in his writings is that Christ is the one teacher of all. We learn all things from Christ. And so our metaphysics, while it may borrow from Aristotle and Plato at times, and other Platonists and other writers, ultimately our metaphysics is a Christian one, because Christ is the sum total of our metaphysics. I think this is an important point also at the beginning of St. John's Gospel, right? Whereas in the beginning was the Logos. So there's this idea of this rational principle, this Logos, that all these different Greek philosophers had been trying to understand and had grasped to different extents. And St. John is telling us that that principle, which they've all been looking after, has now become incarnate in a human person who they now need to be obedient to. All right, so now that we've thought about what the subject of metaphysics is, how we approach it, and so on, we need to consider now what Scotist thinks is the subject of metaphysics, which is the transcendentals. Now, Scotist takes this definition of metaphysics as the science of the transcendentals from St. Albert the Great. But for Scotist, and this definition really wasn't sufficient with Albert, because for Albert and most of the scholastics, the transcendentals were simply that which was convertible with being. But Scotist is going to have a more broad definition of a transcendental. And for Scotist, the transcendental is that which cannot be contained under the categories of finite beings. So if you think about it, we have Aristotle's 10 categories. If you don't know what that is, that's fine. We'll cover it later. And these are really the ways in which we classify everything we see around us. But there are certain things, including God, that cannot be contained under the categories. And so all those things that cannot be contained in the categories are transcendental. And the transcendentals exist irrespective of finite and infinite. So whenever we consider any sort of being, we're going to be discussing the transcendentals. And the reason the transcendentals are not contained in the categories is that the categories presuppose the transcendentals. So already when we're discussing the categories, right, the categories are substance and accident. And all of those presuppose that you already have being, because substance is a certain sort of being, and accident is another sort of being. And so first we have to understand what even is being. So being is not a genus. It's not something that we categorize things in. It transcends beyond category. Now there are 4 fundamental divisions among the transcendentals for Scotus then. There is being, there is the coextensive transcendentals, there is the disjunctive transcendentals, and there is the pure perfections. So we need to analyze what these 4 kinds of transcendentals are. Now, before we can analyze these different types of transcendentals, we need to understand how we make distinctions between things. That's going to be very important because we're going to invoke the distinction when we're talking about being. And within Scotus's metaphysics, the primary distinction we need to invoke is the formal distinction. So we need to understand what the formal distinction is. Now, I think there's a lot of confusion on this because a lot of people have studied St. Thomas's distinctions. And I think they cannot be compared one-to-one with Scotus's distinctions. Because St. Thomas is primarily interested in how the distinction in things relates to the distinctions we make in our mind. Versus for Scotus, he's concerned primarily only with the distinctions as they are in things. So the first kind of distinction we have is a real distinction. A real distinction is a distinction between 2 things. Latin res, right? So res is where we get the word real from. And so all a real distinction is a distinction between 2 res. Now, with finite real distinctions, are always, or at least as far as every example I've ever seen, is going to be separable. But this is not definitional to what makes a real distinction. And even a lot of very good Scotist metaphysicians make this mistake a little bit. Alan Walter, I saw, who's one of the best writers in the English language on Scotus's metaphysics, even makes this distinction. And it's going to become really important when we discuss theology, that separability is not definitional to real distinction. So a finite example of a real distinction would be between a hand and an arm, right? You can cut off the hand, and now you would have a hand and you would have an arm, and those are 2 really distinct things. But an example of an infinite real distinction would be between the persons of the Trinity. And this is actually a Catholic dogma, that there is a real distinction between the persons of the Trinity. And that's why real distinctions, separability cannot be definitional to real distinction. It's simply a good tool to use. If two things are separable, they are necessarily really distinct. But the persons of the Trinity are not separable, but they are still really distinct. The next kind of distinction for Scotus is the formal distinction. So the formal distinction is a distinction between two formalities. So a formality is contained in the thing. The language Scotus uses, a parte re, on the side of the thing. But they're still really identical. So, and this is a really, really hard notion to grasp. But to give some examples so we can understand better what sorts of things Scotus is seeing here, we have between the faculties of the mind and the mind itself, between a triangle and its triangularity. You can never separate a triangle from its triangularity. And triangularity here being understood as the fact that it has three angles. But you can never separate the two. And whenever you have a triangle, it's going to necessarily imply its triangularity. But its triangularity cannot be defined down to it being a triangle. So there are distinct formalities in the triangle, but they are still really identical. You cannot separate them. Between the various modes of being, and this is going to be very important for the study of metaphysics, is that the modes of being are all formally contained in the notion of being. And then also between the persons of the Trinity and the divine essence, and also between the divine attributes. So there is no real distinction between the divine essence, the divine person, and the divine attributes, but they're not formally the same. They're distinct formalities that we can distinguish from one another. Then we also have the conceptual distinction. And the conceptual distinction is something that's only made in the mind. Right? So between Joe Biden and the President of the United States, those are the same person. There's not even a distinct formality of the two. But we can, in our mind, distinguish Joe Biden as Joe Biden and Joe Biden as the President of the United States. We could also consider downhill and uphill. There's only one slope of the hill, but we can consider it distinctly as going downhill or going uphill, depending on which way we are walking it. All right, so now we get to the first distinction of the transcendentals, which is being, or in Latin, ens. Now, what is the definition of being? This is, I think, where most of the, I think even down to theological disputes you're going to get to between Thomists and Scotists. There's actually a lot going to go back to this definition of being. Because for the Thomists, they define being as the actus essendi, the act of being. And so they're primarily going to have a metaphysics of act and potency. But Scotus instead defines being as that to which esse is not repugnant. An esse here is just the Latin word that means to be or to exist. So being is simply that to which existence is not repugnant. And see, a lot of people say that's not really a definition. All you're really saying is that being is that which is not being. And that's pretty much true. And because for Scotus, it's more that we use being to define everything else. We have to assume a concept of being. That's what I meant earlier in terms of we initially have an intuition of being, and that is the start of metaphysics. And this is really what it is. In order to understand anything else, we first have to understand being. And so we already have an intuition of it naturally. And this is, I think, also what St. Bonaventure is talking about when he says that God creates us with this innate light. It's the ability to naturally understand being. And this is, I think, why Scotus is able then to get rid of the language of divine illumination. Because he sees in Henry of Ghent a very troubling view of what divine illumination is. And so he reformulates St. Bonaventure's divine illumination into this univocal concept of being. And so now being just in itself is not a real thing. It's a concept. Now, we know being through real beings, but when we just consider being in itself, it's a concept. And all actual being is divided disjunctively. So when we see real beings, they're either going to be finite beings or infinite beings. So Scotist is not, he defines being univocally. This definition of being, that to which essay is not repugnant, means the same thing. I should actually back up a bit because I do want to make this introductory. Is that there's different ways we can talk about things. So the primary ways we talk about things are either univocally or equivocally. Right. So when I say, my computer and your computer are both computers, we're defining computer here the same way. Versus if I say, Tom Hanks is a star, and a star in the sky is a star. We're using the word star there two different ways. That would be equivocally. Then we can also speak analogically. That's where we speak about things in a similar way, but not the same way. Let me think of an example of. Yeah, we can go to St. Thomas's example. If we say that a medicine is healthy and an animal is healthy, we're not using the word healthy the same way in both of those ways, but there's a similarity between the two because the medicine causes the health of the animal. But the important point Scotist brings out is that we cannot use analogy in terms of logic, right? So I can't say all medicine is healthy. This animal is healthy, therefore the animal is a medicine, right? That would not, actually that doesn't follow. I think that's actually illogical on other levels. But the key point I'm trying to bring out here is that it would fail in part because the term medicine has ultimately been used equivocally here. Analogy is very helpful in terms of language, but it cannot be used logically. And so Scotist says when we define being, because metaphysics is based on logic, we have to define being univocally. But Scotist does not reject the analogy of being, because being is only ever applied analogically. So if I look at a finite being and an infinite being, what do I know about what's in common between them? Well, I know what's in common between them is that they both have being, which is that to which to be is not repugnant. But beyond that, there's not a similarity between them. There's no rejection of analogy, but there is a univocal definition of that term being. And that's what Scotist is concerned about. Imagine if you treat St. Thomas's questions on the divine names in the Summa, you'll actually see that his view is very, very close to Scotist's on this point. Another important point in terms of being is that all the transcendentals are contained formally in the concept of being. So the transcendentals are not, as they were in most of the other scholastics, convertible with being for Scotist, but neither are they really distinct things. They're all already formally contained in that concept of being. Next, we have the coextensive transcendentals. It's important to note these are coextensive transcendentals. They're not convertible for Scotist, because again, they are formally contained in the concept of being, but they aren't formally identical to being, even if they are really identical. So the coextensive transcendentals for Scotist is that we have one, true, and good. That's actually all Scotist has in terms of the coextensive transcendentals. Now, in terms of the ones that are commonly listed, you also commonly get ends, so being. And for Scotist, this is not a coextensive transcendental because it's in its own division of transcendentals. It's what's presumed when we discuss the coextensive transcendentals. And then also commonly listed are race, thing, or aliquid, so something. And for Scotus, those are not, he does not list those among the transcendentals. When we discuss thing, we're simply discussing being as a particular thing. All right, so for the coextensive transcendentals, we have one. Now, all we mean by one, or unity, and probably unity is a better way of translating it, but it's commonly translated as one, is that we mean the concept of being is simple. And this is not a numerical oneness, but metaphysical unity. What I mean by that is you can't line up three concepts of being, and now you have three. The concept of being is in itself one. We cannot multiply the concept of being. And that's what we mean by the concept of being as one. Now, this is going to be then the foundation for later on having the accident of quantity, where now we can have multiple things. But in itself, the concept of being is one, and this is not simply a numerical oneness. There's then true, or truth. And true is being as intelligible. So as we understand being, we are coming to truth. And this means also that falsehood, error, has no being to it. It's simply a corruption of being. And this is the idea that, in terms of political philosophy, that error has no rights, because error has no being to it. It has no truth to it. And for Scotus, truth is not merely conformity with the exemplar cause, which is God, or the human intellect. Being, if no one knew about being would still be true. Truth is contained within being itself, not simply as we come to understand being. And this is important because being is the object of the intellect for Scotus. So we come to know being as true, but it's fundamentally being that's the object of the intellect, not truth itself. And then finally we have good. And now good is that to which nothing is wanting intrinsically. That's actually a direct quote from Scotist, I think from the Reportatio, if I remember correctly when I was gathering this. So being is something as it, or good has something as it has reached its fullness. Well, God is maximal goodness. There's nothing can be more perfect than God. And other things are good insofar as there is nothing wanting in them. And again, for Scotus, being is the object of the will, not goodness in itself. And we should also consider that evil is the privation of good again. So evil has no being in itself. It's not transcendental, just as falsehood is not a transcendental. It's simply a corruption of the good. And hopefully this is all clear. If your people are confused at all, please post questions in the live chat. Or if you're watching this later, in the comments, and I will try and answer. All right. The next set of transcendentals for Scotus are the disjunctive transcendentals. So all being is divided across one of two sides of these transcendentals. Scotus calls them the extremes of the transcendentals. And now the disjuncts are where we get into things that are not called transcendentals by earlier scholastics. But Scotus is not making these up. He draws them from St. Bonaventure's Disputed Questions on the Mystery of the Trinity. And it's really St. Bonaventure who worked these out, and then Scotus who figured out how to fully work them into our system of metaphysics. And it's also important to note that these are coextensive with being in terms of being a disjunct. So all being is either infinite or finite, but some beings are infinite and some beings are finite. So all being is infinite or finite. So if we consider infinite or finite as one singular disjunct, that is in fact coextensive with being. But we call them disjunctive because each thing is on one or the other end of that disjunct. Now, an important point Scotus brings up, and this is really the foundation of the ontological argument, and it's why Scotus affirms the ontological argument of St. Anselm. And so these are really rooted in St. Anselm, is that if something is on the less noble side of the extreme, we can conclude that the other noble extreme exists in some being. So if we find finite beings, we know there has to be an infinite being. If we find a dependent being, we know that an independent being has to exist. And this is the foundation of Scotus's argument for the existence of God, is trying to prove how we go from one end, the less noble end of the disjunct, to the more noble end of the disjunct. So there are two categories then, not categories really, because there's no categories in the transcendentals. But to speak analogically, there are categories. And so we can distinguish between the correlative ones and the contradictorily opposed transcendentals. So the correlative transcendentals are, or disjuncts, are those which, if we have something on one end, we can see a relation to the one on the other end. So we have prior and posterior. So if we find there is a posterior being, secondary being, there has to be a prior being that causes it. We have exceeding, exceeded, and this is in terms of eminence or greatness. So if we find a being that is exceeded in greatness, it's only exceeded because there's a being that exceeds it. And likewise, cause and caused. If something is caused, it must be because there is a cause that causes it. And so these are related to one another directly. We also have the contradictorily opposed transcendentals. So the contradictorily opposed disjuncts mean that something, there's not necessarily a relationship between the two, but something has to be in one or two of the categories. Or the disjuncts, rather, sorry, not the categories. So we have infinite finite, we have actual potential, we have independent dependent, necessary contingent, substance accident, absolute relative, simple composed, one many, same different, and so on. And these are not meant to be exhaustive. These are simply all the ones that Scotus lists. There's also two in St. Bonaventure that he lists that Scotus does not list. And these are participative participates. This is not necessary in Scotus anymore. It's actually disputed why exactly. So Walter thinks that this is taken up within the infinite finite distinction. But it seems to me more likely it's within the cause-cause distinction. And that participation for Bonaventure is an exemplary cause. And we're going to go into what an exemplary cause is later on. And so once you have then just caused generally, I think you no longer need one that specifically marks out a exemplary cause. And then the other one that Bonaventure lists is immobile mobile. And I think this no longer becomes, or this is for Scotus considered part of metaphysics. It's part of physics because it considers mobile being that, not being in itself. And so Scotus here, he's not rejecting St. Bonaventure. He's simply drawing more exact distinctions. But I think there's nothing wrong with using these distinctions in St. Bonaventure. And we should note, if we look at all of these, we can see very clearly that God is on one end of all of these, and everything else is on the other end. So God is prior to all things, we are posterior. God exceeds all things, we are exceeded. God causes all things, we are caused. God is infinite, we are finite. God is actual, we are potential, and so on and so forth. Now, with respect to other things, we're going to start seeing that there is some sense in which these apply to us, but not necessarily so. We'll see. Ultimately, we are still on the less noble end of all of these disjuncts, and it's only in an analogical sense we can apply the more noble end to ourselves. That's an important point. We're going to go into it, act, potency, and so on. Scotus isn't using these words in the exact same ways we ordinarily use them when he's discussing the disjuncts. And so now we're going to discuss what most people, and sort of for Thomas, is in Aristotle's, the key point in metaphysics, is the act-potency distinction, or in Latin, actus in potentia. So, act-potency for Scotus is contained in metaphysics, but it's not its primary subject. The primary subject is the transcendentals. Primarily, we discuss act-potency in terms of natural philosophy for Scotus. But I'm going to go into that as well a little bit here. because that nowadays is more frequently spoken of as part of metaphysics, even though really it should be considered as part of natural philosophy. So if we consider the act-potency distinction as transcendentals, we're speaking of it in terms of modes of being. So all things are either actual or potential. That is, something can actually exist or it can potentially exist. And it's God who actually exists, and we who don't fully actually exist. And these are contradictorily opposed. So all things are either actual or potential in terms of this basic transcendental division. But then we can apply it analogically in terms of finite beings. And now it's part of the subject of physics, not metaphysics, and it's not contradictorily opposed. But we still use it very frequently, so we should go over it now. And it's going to be very, very important when we're considering things related to metaphysics. And so actuality, when we're speaking of it here, is something existing according to the fullness of its nature. And then potency is some privation of act. Right? So if you have a tree, right, as fully as a growing tree, it's in act, it's now achieved the fullness of its nature. But when it's an acorn, it's in potency. And things can be in relative stages of actuality. So even once it's a tree, it's not as actual as God is actual. And if it's growing up as a tree and it's halfway grown, it's in act with respect to the acorn, but it's with potency with respect to the full-grown tree. And potency is some privation of that act, some limitation of it. Now we can consider sort of two kinds of potency. We can consider active potency and passive potency. So active potency is something having the power to become act within itself. So I'm trying to think. I have the power here to pick up this glass. So now I've moved it from a state of potential to a state of actual by picking up the glass. But my hand had that power within itself. Versus on the other hand, this glass had the passive potency to be able to be picked up. It had that power, but it could not on its own actualize being picked up. An outside agent had to actualize that. All right, now we want to consider different types of causes. So how does something move from potency to act, or act to potency? So Aristotle distinguishes four types of causes: the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. And we're going to add to this as well the exemplary cause, which is really the primary cause in terms of metaphysics. So we can consider the principles of act and potency intrinsic to a thing. And here then, the material cause is what is potential, and the formal cause is what is actual. So a material cause is what the thing is made of, and the formal cause is that which makes the matter to be a certain thing. Right? So we have prime matter that's then informed by glassness, the form of glass, which makes it to be glass. Within a human, the soul is the form of the body. So my soul is what makes me to not just be a body, but to be a living human. We consider it analogically in terms of what we call artifacts. So if we talk about a statue might be made of marble and then have the form of a certain statue that makes it to be that statue. Now we should note that artifacts themselves do not have forms. They only natures do. Right? So St. Thomas, this beautiful passage in his commentary on the physics, where he says nature is as though the shipbuilder could cause the ship to actually have the power of motion within itself. There has to be something outside that moves the ship, because the ship is going to have is only going to be an artifact. It's made up of pieces of wood that have a nature within them that makes them to be wood. And it's important that we understand a distinction between artifacts and natures. This causes a lot of confusion because we frequently talk about artifacts when we're trying to understand formal causality. But within the thing itself, the form only exists in natural things. Um, this is important also because modern philosophy, starting with Francis Bacon, rejects formal causality. And Scotist, following the whole scholastic tradition, thinks that formal causality is extremely important. But also another important point to note in terms of a difference between um, Scotus and St. Thomas on this is that Scotus, following the church fathers, allows for a plurality of forms in a thing, and particularly in living things. So not only do I have my soul that makes my body to be alive, I also have a form of my body that makes my body to be a body. I have a form of my heart that makes my heart to be a heart. And the lower forms are ordered to these higher forms. And this is the view of most of the church fathers as well. St. Thomas more strictly follows Aristotle in thinking that there's only a singular form. So there's no form of my body apart from the form of my soul. And once the soul leaves my body would now be informed by the form of a corpse. And if you'd like to know more about that, I did a whole long 2-hour discussion on the Dogs with Torches podcast about Scotus's view of formal causality. And this teaching of things being made of form and matter is called hylomorphism. We only put that up on the screen for people just beginning in this. So we have hylomorphism. This is made of the Greek words hulos, meaning matter, and morphe, meaning form. So it's basically saying things are made of matter and form. We can also consider the extrinsic causes. So the extrinsic actual cause is the efficient cause, and the extrinsic potential cause is the final cause. So efficient cause, basically the outside force that makes a thing to move. It's what we usually call causality today. So if we say, like I caused the stream to go live, we're usually thinking nowadays of how I went and I hit the go live button on the stream. And so it's important when we're discussing causality in a scholastic sense, we don't just limit it to efficient causality. We then also have final causality. This is actually really in terms of natural causes, this is really the most important cause for Aristotle and the whole scholastic tradition. It's the final cause is that for the sake of which. So I started this stream in order to teach everyone here about metaphysics. There's a certain reason things happen, and this even happens on the natural level. So if you drop a stone, the stone moves down for Aristotle. It's a certain tendency to be there. It has a certain final cause. And ultimately, the final cause of the whole universe, if you went and you took all the final causes in the universe and you strung them together in a long web of in a long chain, essentially, you would eventually find a final cause of all things is God. And actually, we find within what Scotus calls the signs of the divine will, or what has been revealed in Scripture, we find that it's actually Christ that is the final cause of all things. He is the reason for which everything happens. And to add to these four causes, Saint Bonaventure, he's really drawing this from the church fathers, especially the Eastern ones, such as Saint Dionysius and Saint Maximus, is this idea of exemplary causality. An exemplary causality is a production of a certain likeness. And since this is not in terms of act potency, we can even understand some sense there is exemplary causality within the Trinity. That when we call the Son the image of the Father, this is because he is in some sense caused in an exemplary sense by the Father. And this is not in terms of any of the four natural causes. It's not in terms of act and potency. Because we do not want to say there is any potentiality within God. If we go back to those disjuncts, God is entirely on the side of actuality. Another important point is that a lot of people, they reduce exemplarity in certain ways. So a common thing you'll see is to reduce St. Bonaventure's teaching on exemplarity to either a formal or an efficient cause. And it is sort of a formal efficient cause, but it can't be reduced to either of those categories. So it really has to be its own type of cause. It's also, a lot of people think in terms of Platonic exemplarity, especially Neoplatonic exemplarity. But it's not exactly the same thing, because within Neoplatonism, there is simply an emanation from God. And if we go back to St. Bonaventure, he says that, and I go back to his quote here. Here we go. Right, what is the sum total of our metaphysics? Concerned with emanation, exemplarity, and consummation. So if we go back to the types of causes, here we go. Emanation is the efficient cause, God's creating. Consummation is that final cause, the end of all things. But there's also a distinct exemplarity, which is distinct from those. And this is because exemplarity is a personal act. It's the production of a free production of a certain likeness. And so it's only within a will, either finite or infinite, that we can have exemplary causality, because it's the only thing that can freely create a likeness. This is also then going to have to do with how we're going to understand the will and so on and so forth. So this could go on a whole separate stream, which I might do in terms of Scotist psychology. But here we just want to understand that there's this exemplary causality, which cannot be reduced to any of the four natural causes that are in terms of act and potency. Exemplarity is not in terms of act and potency. Then understand causal series. And with causal series, this can be very important for Scotus' proof for the existence of God, is that there are accidental or essential and accidental ordered series. Or we find for essential, we're going to put up some words here. So per se, here we go, per se, which means through itself. Or we can have an accidental series, which is, here we go, per accidens. So through another is going to be a thing. So per se means through itself, and per accidens means through another. And so an essential causal series is one in which the lower causes rely on the causality of the higher. And so we say the lower causes are merely instrumental. It's the highest cause, the first cause in the series, that actually causes everything. And the lower causes are simply instruments of that higher cause. So sort of the classic example of this, and I think Scotus himself uses it, is a hand pushing a stick pushing a rock. Right? So if a hand takes a stick and you push a rock with it, if you drop that stick, the rock will cease to move as well. The rock only moves from the hand. Now, the stick is the thing that moves it, but it moves it on account of the hand. The stick has no power within itself. Another example would be a carpenter using a hammer to build a table. I mean, when a carpenter uses a hammer to build a table, it's not the hammer that builds the table, it's the carpenter. But the carpenter builds it through the hammer. Most importantly, God sustaining the world is an essential causal series. And this is very important because even if the world were eternally old, there would still need to be a God. God would still be necessary to cause the world because contingency. If we go back to our disjuncts, look at one, for example, necessary and contingent. Well, a contingent thing requires something necessary to be founded upon. And so that necessary thing still has to exist because it's in an essentially ordered series. So the world cannot explain itself, even if it were infinitely old. It's not that it simply has to begin to exist. It's that it actually has to be caused to exist outside of time. And this is why St. Thomas, and I think Scotus as well, say that it could have been entirely possible that the world could have been infinitely old. St. Thomas actually wrote a whole book on this to argue that it's a bad argument to say that the world was, to say you could prove the world is created. We know the world is created and began to exist in time through divine revelation. And one could say now maybe there's scientific evidence for it or so on. St. Bonaventure, on the other hand, thought very clearly you could use logical arguments to prove the world had to have a beginning. Scotist never takes a clear position on this, but seems to allow, at least for the sake of argument, the world could be infinitely old, and that wouldn't actually prove that God doesn't exist. Secondly, we consider an accidentally ordered series. And this is one in which the lower causes have their own causal power. And so the lower causes are agents, right? So one example we could have is a father has a son, and then the son has his own son, so the grandson, right? When the father has a son, if that father dies, the son can still have his own son. If the father does not want his son to have a son, he can't stop his son from having another son. Right? The son now has that power to have his own son through himself, not through his father. Another example would be winding up a toy. Right? So if you take sort of one of those wind-up cars and you wind it up all the way and you let it go and it goes across the floor, you don't anymore have to be causing it to move. It has now the power in itself through that spring that you winded up to be able to move. All right. Here we go. All right. Now we consider the substance-accident distinction. So if you go back, this is one of our many disjuncts here. But when Scotist is considering the disjunct of substance and accident, he's thinking more about this distinction between essentially and accidentally ordered series. But we also have this substance-accident distinction in terms of natural philosophy. And this comes up a lot as well, so I think it's important to cover here, especially because nowadays it's frequently spoken of as part of metaphysics, but really more properly it's part of natural philosophy. And actually we usually consider, in terms of the breakdown of subjects, substance-accident within this study of logic, because we want to logically categorize things, since we categorize them as substance and accident. And actually within Aristotle's logic, this is the first thing studied in logic, and so it frequently retained its order as the first thing studied in logic. Now what we mean when we say substance is something that exists in itself, an accident as exists in another. Right, so again, going back to per se versus per accidens. So there is a very close relationship in terms of meaning when we're talking about essentially and accidentally ordered causes, is when we talk about substance and accidents as things. And we say exists in itself, we don't mean absolutely speaking in terms of finite things, because of course nothing except God truly exists in himself. But we say relatively speaking, it exists in itself. Versus accident is something that's going to inhere in a substance. It could not exist without that substance. So we can speak of two kinds of substances. We can speak of what Aristotle calls secondary substance and primary substance. Now this language of secondary and primary substance tend to move away from that later on. Instead we speak of secondary substances in terms of essence or common nature, and we tend to speak of primary substance as a supposit, or usually when we say substance, we mean a particular substance. We mean a primary substance, that is. That's usually what the scholastics mean when they speak about substance, but that's not always the case. So when we speak of a common nature of things, we say that there is a real common nature between members of the same species. And by species here, we mean genus and species as referring to classification in general, not just modern biology. So the biological use of genus and species would just be one application of this larger principle of genus and species as classification. So genus is a category, and then species is a particular thing within that category. And so we say if we take all things in a certain category, so we take all humans, they share a common human nature. If we talk about all trees, they share a common tree nature. We take all stones, they share a common stone nature. And this is not just a nice idea we have. They really share a common nature. So Scotist extremely strongly rejects what's called nominalism. There's an idea that it's come before William of Ockham, but he really helps to popularize the idea. He's not a full-on nominalist. But to some extent he is. Well, it's more closer to what we call a conceptualist. But the essential idea in nominalism is that things only are what we name them to be. And Scotist says, no, there's a real nature in things. There's a real humanness a human has. This was actually first suggested by Plato. But Plato suggests that there is some world, what he calls the realm of forms, where there is a humanness out there. And Aristotle says, no, that humanness is not located off in some other world. It's in each human. And so each individual human has their human nature within themselves. And so this is going to be important because when we talk about finite beings, there is a common nature, but there is no human nature out there that's separate. Each individual human has their own instance of human nature as a primary substance. This is the case with any finite beings. Within God, each of the three divine persons, they don't have three instances of the divine nature because their being is infinite. They have one divine nature that they all share. But we don't all share one human nature itself. We share what Scotist calls a common nature, that it's all alike as a nature. In terms of finite things, right? So we have this human nature, but what makes this human nature to be the human nature in me versus the human nature in you? And so within the view of most of the scholastics, this is the view of most people historically, it is matter. So you are made up of one set of matter, and I'm made up of another set of matter. But Scotist, for a bunch of arguments that would be very complicated to put into an introductory video, said that this is not sufficient. And so he then says, with all finite things, what distinguishes particular things is a certain, what he calls heichetas, what's often called haixeity in English. It's a certain thisness something has. And people ask us, what is a haixeity? Well, it's simply the thisness. What makes you to be you? It's your yourness. What makes me to be me? It's my me-ness. Since Scotist says it can't be defined beyond that. Now, we can never know directly someone else's haixeity, at least in this life. And God knows perfectly what makes me, me, and what makes you, you. But I can never fully grasp this directly. Now, it could be God perhaps could reveal this to me, but ordinarily, through natural means, we cannot know someone else's haixeity. So an accident, then, is something that exists in another. So it exists in the substance. And you can think of accidents sort of as the attributes of a thing. This is not an entirely sufficient definition, but it's a good way of starting to think about it. So there are 9 categories of accidents. If you want to look up what these are, you can just Google Aristotle's categories. There's some dispute then about should these 9 categories be classified within categories themselves. Some of them seem to be relatively similar to one another. But Aristotle sort of came up with 9 categories. That's sort of what we stuck with as a basic rule of thumb, is that there are these 9 categories of accidents. Now, an important thing to note is that God has no accidents, because accidents are really distinct from the substance. And so, right, they're a different thisness of it, or a different reality of it. So if I were to change, right, so I have brownness for my hair as it's accidentally brown. But if I dyed my hair blonde, I would still continue to be me. That would not change my substance at all. And so the attributes of a thing exist in it. But they are really distinct from that substance then. And within God, there are no, important point, within God, there are no real distinctions. God has distinct formalities within him, but the only real distinctions are the distinctions between the divine persons. And that's because that's not a distinction in God, but between persons of God. And each person of God is fully the divine essence. So God has no accidents because he has no real distinctions in himself. All right, the final category we have here is what Scotist calls the pure or simple perfections. And so now the definition of and so now we're going back to the transcendentals again, just to be clear. All of these last few slides, we've been discussing things closely related to the transcendentals, but aren't themselves transcendentals. Now we're back in the transcendentals. So the definition of a pure perfection is that which is better to have than not to have. This is taken from St. Anselm. It's the foundation of his ontological argument, fundamentally. Right? Anselm says there are certain things that are better to have than not to have. And so these were called pure perfections. And so this is going to be different from what we call limited perfections. Now, the pure perfections are not coextensive with being, but can exist in a being irrespective of infinite and finite. So what we mean by that is that, let's take, for example, intellect, right, as a pure perfection. Not everything that exists has intellect. A rock doesn't have intellect, an animal doesn't have intellect, a planet doesn't have intellect, but a human has an intellect, an angel has an intellect, and God has an intellect. So all three of us have intellects. And so intellect can exist in something irrespective of finite and infinite. And so it cannot be included in the categories. But if it was included in the categories, then it would have to be accidental. And God can't have accidents. So then God would not be able to have an intellect. And so intellect for Scotist is not an accident, but is a pure perfection that can exist irrespective of finite and infinite. Now, all the pure perfections must be mutually compatible and simple, because God is simple, and all of the pure perfections, right? If they're pure perfections, it must be better to have them than not to have them. So you must be able then to have all the pure perfections, because that would be better to have all of them than not to have them. And so therefore they must all be mutually compatible with one another. And ultimately we see that God has all the pure perfections to the highest degree. And that's the conclusion of St. Anselm's ontological argument. And so all of them must then be simple. And if we had distinct, if they were complex, to be able to break them up into their parts, then each of those would actually be the pure perfection. And so these pure perfections, Scotist doesn't actually list them anywhere. We could think of them as things like intellect, will, love, beauty, justice, power. Consider probably any of the virtues in here and so on. But all of these are things that God has to an infinite degree. And then various finite things have them to various finite degrees. And this is also, again, another point where the disagreements between Thomists and Scotists on the relationship between the soul, the intellect, and the will are going to work. Is since intellect is a pure perfection, it's a distinct formality in the soul, but it's not really a really distinct accident in the soul. Versus the Thomists are going to consider intellect and will primarily in terms of act and potency. The Scotists are going to consider them primarily in terms of pure perfections that are transcendental. Then we also should note that this does not include limited perfections. So a limited perfection, and it sounds kind of contradictory to the word limited, but a limited perfection is something that is always subject to increase. And so they're contrary to infinite being. And so they cannot be in any being, irrespective of finite and infinite. So an example I often invoke is running, right? If you can run really fast, someone could always run faster. Someone runs 10 miles an hour, someone could run 20 miles an hour. And of course, you can't physically do that as a human, but in theory, something could. And there could be an infinite number of miles per hour someone could run. Perhaps there might be physical limitations, the speed of light and so on. But in theory, someone could run an infinite number of miles per hour. You could always increase that. And so God, since God's infinity is not a numeric infinity, but is rather a metaphysical infinity, God cannot run. Right? God cannot run any number of miles an hour, because any number of miles an hour God could run would be some finite amount. So that's actually a limited perfection. That's necessarily limited to a certain amount someone can have it. Another example, and this actually comes from Guanilo in his objection to St. Anselm, is being a good island. The St. Anselm says there are certain things that you're better to have than not to have. Consider that in itself there has to be a being that's going to have all the pure perfections to the highest degree. That's sort of the metaphysical version of St. Anselm's argument. And Guanilo responds and says, well, what about an island? Does this mean the perfect island must exist? Because the perfect island, it's better for it to have the best things of an island than not to have, so it must exist. And St. Anselm responds that these are actually limited perfections. He doesn't use that language, but this is essentially how Scotist would phrase it. Is that right? You could always add one more palm tree to an island. You could always make it slightly nicer. And so, since you could always make the island slightly nicer, it must be limited. And so, there does not have to necessarily be an infinitely good island. Let's see. There we go. Mickvine, I see your comment there, but I'm a bit confused by what you mean. I can answer it after this if you could clarify a bit more. All right, so now for a conclusion then, sort of let's summarize everything we've been discussing here. So metaphysics is the study of being, irrespective of infinite or finite, and thus discusses the transcendentals. And the transcendentals are those things which transcend the categories of being. So Scotist can say that metaphysics is the science of the transcendentals, where we study being in itself and being's properties. And there are four kinds of transcendentals. There is being, there is coextensive transcendental, there are disjunctive transcendentals, and there are pure perfections. And so the coextensive, disjunctive, and pure perfections are all contained in the concept of being, but are not formally identical with it, even if they are really identical with it. Now, metaphysics then is the foundation of all the other sciences that we might consider. Everything else, both natural and divine, is going to take its principles from the conclusions of metaphysics. So it's very important that we get our metaphysics right. And we should also always remember that our metaphysics is a Christian metaphysics, as Christ is the one teacher of all. You could create a very good metaphysics that doesn't take into account the examples in theology. It's all going to fail. If you don't have a substance-accident distinction, how can you take account of the Eucharist? If you don't have a distinction between person and nature, how can you distinguish the persons and nature of the Trinity? All of that has to be considered within our metaphysics. And even more importantly than all of that, we think, what is the point of metaphysics? The point of metaphysics is to lead us back to Jesus Christ. Because Christ is the Logos. He is that principle of rationality that was made man. And it also leads us back to Mary. Because it is through Mary that Christ enters the world. And she is predestined with him as the first intention of the divine will. All right, so there we go. That is the basics of Scotus on metaphysics. If anyone has any questions now, I can answer them. I'll give people a few seconds to put in any questions they have. Let's see. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll just end the stream here. So thank you everyone for watching, and if you do have any more questions on this, please leave a comment below.